In today's flip lecture, we're going to take a look at the causes of the Civil War after talking is going to turn into violence. And the start of this story is going to be in the Kansas-Nebraska territory, which will become known as Bleeding Kansas. But before we get into that, a quick biography. Stephen A. Douglas is going to be a senator from Illinois. His nickname is the Little Giant. He's known for his small stature and his very powerful speaking voice. He becomes the leader of the Democratic Party, and he's one of Chicago's first great politicians. He's going to be the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and his belief in popular sovereignty is going to come through. But ultimately, Stephen A. Douglas is going to be one of the most influential politicians of this time we're going to take a look at. And the question that Americans have to deal with in the 1850s is the question of the Kansas and the Nebraska territory. Settlers were very eager to move into that territory after it's discovered that it's very good farmland and there's a number of resources on it. But the South didn't really want Kansas and Nebraska to start turning into states because they were north of the compromise line, and the fear was that soon the free states would vastly outnumber the slaves. But Stephen A. Douglas really wanted to push for statehood for the Kansas and Nebraska territory, mostly because the Transcontinental Railroad, a railroad that would connect the east to the west, was being built, and the major question was, where was it going to go? One of the proposed routes would take the railroad through Chicago. And by taking the railroad through Chicago, it would actually make the city the center and the hub of trade between the East and the West in the United States, which would make Chicago very powerful. And so Stephen A. Douglas pushed very much for Kansas and Nebraska statehood for the purpose of putting the railroad through Chicago. And if you kind of take a look at the map, you can see how if you're going to go from east to west, you need to go through that Kansas territory if you're going to be going through Chicago. And so Stephen A. Douglas drafts a law called the Kansas-Nebraska Act that would provide for statehood for Kansas and Nebraska. It would open it up to build railroads as well as settlement from settlers from the east. This act also said that slavery in these two states would be decided by popular sovereignty, even though both territories were north of the Compromise of 1820 line. And so ultimately, what he is saying is that the Missouri Compromise is no more. And so the North became outraged by this, and they pushed back against this Kansas-Nebraska Act. But ultimately, the act passed, which is going to lead to a very tough situation that's going to be known as Bleeding Kansas and also the Border War. And so for almost 10 years, from 1854 until the end of the Civil War in 1865, Kansas has its own civil war, where both pro and anti-slavery people are going to try to rush into Kansas in order to try to influence the popular sovereignty vote on slavery. And when they go into the territory, they also bring their weapons. Pro-slavery border ruffians, as they are called, from Missouri, storm into Kansas over the border in order to try to intimidate anti-slavery people and in order to try to swing the vote in favor of slavery. Anti-slaveries in Kansas, known as Jayhawkers, and similar groups are also going to arm themselves, which leads to the breakout of a mini civil war after the initial vote is held and Kansas votes to become a slave state. And so a government is created, and a pro-slavery Congress is elected in the state, but in response, the anti-slavery settlers set up their own government. So now you have two governments in Kansas, both claiming to be the government, and that leads to open warfare between the two groups. Over 200 people are killed, thousands are wounded, and over $2 million worth of property is damaged in this Bleeding Kansas. And so the tensions over slavery have now spilled over, because of this popular sovereignty vote, into all-out war pitting citizens against citizens in the territory. But the violence would not be contained to Bleeding Kansas, and the violence would even reach the floor of the United States Senate in the event of the caning of Charles Sumner. Now, Senator Charles Sumner was a popular northern senator from Massachusetts who gave a lengthy speech in the Senate condemning the South, slavery, and especially in particular one southern senator by the name of Andrew Butler. He called Mr. Butler a pimp for slavery and essentially insulted him repeatedly. Now, Preston Brooks, who is a member of the House of Representatives, also happened to be Butler's cousin, and decided that this kind of attack on his family's honor had to be kind of dealt with. Initially, he was going to duel Charles Sumner, but then he decided that Sumner was not on the same social standing as him, so he decided that the only thing to do was to attack Sumner in the Senate with his cane in order to make sure that Charles Sumner knew that these slights against his family honor could not go unpunished. And so on the floor of the United States Senate, Preston Brooks attacked Charles Sumner with his cane, hitting him repeatedly over and over, and he actually permanently cripples Charles Sumner through this beating. And so tensions, even between politicians who are supposed to talk and compromise, is going to spill over into violence in the U.S. Senate. But this reveals the deep divide in American culture between North and South, where Northerners saw this as proof of the negatives of Southern savage slave culture, and so Sumner becomes a martyr for the anti-slavery cause. Among Southerners, many are very proud that Brooks had defended the honor of the South. One newspaper wrote that Sumner should be caned every day. And actually, many admirers sent Preston Brooks new canes with encouraging messages saying things like, "hit him again." And so this cane of Charles Sumner, an incredibly violent event on the floor of the United States Senate, reveals these very deep divisions in American culture. Another thing that is going to reveal deep division in America is going to be a Supreme Court case involving a slave called Dred Scott. Now, Dred Scott was a slave who had lived for a time in Illinois and Wisconsin, which were both free states. And so he sued for his freedom, claiming that when he lived in those free states, he should have been freed by his master. And so this went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Roger Taney, himself a slave owner, ended up giving the majority opinion in which the Supreme Court ruled that slaves are not people, they are not citizens, they are property, and therefore they have no right to sue in American courts. And the second piece of the ruling said that the federal government could not ban slavery in any new territories. Though it has nothing to do with the case, the Supreme Court is trying to go on record saying that they believe that every state had the right to vote on slavery and that the federal government could not actually abolish it. And in his decision, Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote that, in the opinion of the court, in the history of the times and the language used in the Declaration of Independence, that neither the class of persons who have been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were acknowledged as a part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used by that memorable instrument, saying that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution intentionally left slaves and also free blacks out of their definition of the people. And he also said that slaves had no rights which white men were bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for the benefit of the slaves themselves. And so Roger Taney's Dred Scott decision was decried by many in the abolitionist movement and celebrated by many in the South. And in response to all these tensions, in the year 1854, a new political party was founded called the Republican Party. And their platform was free soil, free labor, and free men, in that they opposed the expansion of slavery, they wanted to modernize the economy and favored high tariffs, and they wanted to give western lands to settlers and keep slave owners off of new territories. And so this party is going to set itself up in direct opposition to southern interests. And so by 1858, young Abraham Lincoln of Illinois had risen up in this new Republican Party, and he was their candidate to run for the Senate seat in Illinois. And in a very famous speech in 1858, before the Senate race, he gave a speech in which he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." And so slavery became the centerpiece of the Illinois Senate race in 1858, pitting the powerful Stephen A. Douglas against the up-and-comer Abraham Lincoln. And the main issue of the election is going to be slavery and its spread into new territories. And so the two men agreed to hold a series of 7 debates across Illinois so that they could debate this issue and that the people of Illinois could then choose between the two men who they wanted to represent them. But these debates became national news, and they ended up being reprinted in newspapers word for word across the country. And so while Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas are debating slavery, the country itself is using this to debate slavery within itself. And the debate comes down to the issue of popular sovereignty versus the issue of free soil. But ultimately in 1858, Douglas defeated Lincoln in the election, but Abraham Lincoln would be back in 1860 to accept his party's nomination for president. And so with tensions this high, sometimes all you need to turn tensions into violence and civil war is a spark. And that spark is going to come in the figure of John Brown. Now, John Brown is an interesting figure. He believes that he is given a mission by God to destroy slavery in the United States. And so John Brown takes it upon himself to originally go to Kansas, and he becomes one of the most feared anti-slavery fighters in the Kansas Territory, including attacking pro-slavery people with broadswords. John Brown and his family, his sons, make a new plan after leaving Kansas. The plan is to seize Harper's Ferry Arsenal, a store of weapons in Virginia, and to start a slave rebellion that would destroy slavery in the South. Now what happens is John Brown does raid Harper's Ferry. They take over the arsenal, but no slaves rise up to meet John Brown, and his slave rebellion is stopped by U.S. Marines, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, you'll know him later, and they capture Brown, and he is eventually executed for treason. So John Brown's raid is a failed slave rebellion, but it's incredibly consequential because after John Brown is hung for treason, in the South, he's considered a villain. Nathaniel Hawthorne said no man ever more justly hanged. But in the North, he becomes a hero and a martyr for the anti-slavery cause. But ultimately, John Brown's raid convinces Southerners that Northerners were plotting to destroy the Southern way of life through slave uprising. And because of that, Southern militias began training and arming themselves intensely to defend themselves against slaves and possibly the North. And this is really the beginnings of the Confederate Army. So after all that had happened in 1860, the United States is going to have a presidential election, pitting 4 candidates against each other in a race that is going to divide the country, as you can see from the map, by North, South, and even with the border states. And the 4 candidates are Stephen A. Douglas, John Breckinridge, Abraham Lincoln, and John Bell. Stephen A. Douglas and John Breckinridge both run as Democrats, which is actually going to split the Democratic vote between North and South. Abraham Lincoln runs as the Republican candidate, and John Bell ran on a new party called the Party of Constitutional Union. And as you can see, Breckinridge gets the support of the South, Bell gets the support of the border states, and Lincoln wins all of the North. And so the Republican Party under Lincoln is going to be a free soil party, opposing slavery in the new territories, but they are very clear that they do not support the immediate abolition of slavery. But they supported tariffs, and so therefore to the South, they see this as a Northern party representing Northern interests. And so when Abraham Lincoln is elected, with only 40% of the popular vote, but enough in the Electoral College to win, Lincoln is going to win without even being on the ballot in 10 of the southern states, which means that in 10 of the southern states, you could not even vote for Abraham Lincoln if you wanted to. And so for the South, they see the election as Lincoln as the last straw in a long series of northern abuses of the South. And so ultimately, they see the northern states electing a northern president with a northern agenda. And so after his election, the South Carolina's government voted to secede from the United States of America and declare themselves an independent nation. Believing that once Lincoln was elected, the North would dominate the South, they decided that they would leave and dissolve the Union itself. Following in their footsteps will be Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And after the war is going to break out between the North and the South, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas, a total of 11 states, are going to join the Southern Confederacy. And so there will be no further compromise. The Confederate States of America were declared free and independent of the United States of America, and the seeds of war were sown. The Confederate States declare independence. They pass a constitution that gives the states more rights, as well as protects slavery. Elections are held, and a Confederate government is created with Southern Senator Jefferson Davis elected as the president of the Confederacy. And so this is the map. In 1860, after the United States had elected Abraham Lincoln president. And so in January of 1861, Abraham Lincoln takes the inauguration of president and takes the oath to defend and preserve the United States of America. He takes the oath at a time when half of the country has declared independence, and the issue of civil war loomed over the country. And in Lincoln's inauguration, he said, "In your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." And so Abraham Lincoln tried to avoid war, and in his conclusion, he said, "I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when once again touched, as they surely will be, by the better angels of our nature." But Lincoln's dream that the better angels of our nature would be touched are going to go up in flames in April of 1861 at the United States Fort Sumter, in which South Carolina's militia has surrounded, and soon the Civil War would begin.